request, investigations by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, by Police Service of Northern Ireland, and by the Office of the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland, as well as a review at the request of the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown by Sir Peter Gibson, the then Intelligence Services Commissioner. In 2013, my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, decided not to establish a public inquiry into the Omagh bombing. My right honourable friend's decision regarding the holding of a public inquiry was made in light of the situation as it was at that time. Michael Gallagher, who lost his son Aidan in the bombing, pursued a judicial review of the decision not to establish a public inquiry into whether there had been a failure to investigate whether the Omagh bomb could have been prevented. Following a short summary judgment in July 2021, the Northern Ireland High Court found in October 2021 that plausible arguments could be made that the state had failed to comply with its obligation under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights to take reasonable steps to prevent the bombing. It identified 4 grounds which gave rise to the plausible arguments of preventability. These relate to the handling and sharing of intelligence, the use of cell phone analysis, whether there was advanced knowledge or reasonable means of knowledge of the bomb, and whether disruption operations could or should have been mounted which may have helped prevent the tragedy. The court did not prescribe the form of investigation that should take place. It left that to be decided by the state authorities. I've taken time since coming into post to consider carefully the full judgment. I've met Mr. Gallagher and representatives of the support group he chairs, the Omagh Support and Self-Help Group, which works to promote and advocate for the needs of victims of terrorism. I visited the site of the bomb with them, a very sobering experience, and crossed the road to the Memorial Garden, which commemorates all those who lost their lives. I've also met representatives of Families Moving On, another support group doing incredibly valuable work, helping victims and survivors to recover, grow and sustain a sense of well-being. I've listened to the representations of these families and taken their varying perspectives into account. I've considered important factors such as the independence of any future investigation, the cost to the public purse, and how best to allay wider public concern. I've weighed these up against the clear findings set out by the court, which we must meet for any investigation to be effective and compliant with our international obligations, and which are at the core of my decision. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I intend to establish an independent statutory inquiry into the Omagh bombing. I've informed Mr. Gallagher and members of the Omagh Support and Self-Help Group, as well as representatives of Families Moving On, of this decision. The inquiry will focus specifically on the 4 grounds which the court held as giving rise to plausible arguments that the bombing could have been prevented. The inquiry will also need to take account with the findings of previous investigations to avoid duplication. I know that this is a significant decision, and I'm keen to explain now to the House why I believe it is also the most appropriate course of action. Firstly, the inquiry will allow us to meet our Article 2 procedural obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights, as it will have powers of compulsion and be capable of compelling the production of documents and witnesses and subjecting their accounts to scrutiny. The 2008 Gibson review of the Omagh bombing did not have such statutory powers, meaning that Sir Peter Gibson had no means of compelling witness testimony. It's important that any investigation has sufficient tools at its disposal to access all necessary evidence and materials, and it's for this reason that I discounted the option of a non-statutory inquiry. I also discounted referring the Omagh case to the yet-to-be-established Independent Commission of Reconciliation and Information Recovery, which will be established by the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Bill that is currently being considered by the other place. This new body will have all the powers required to access all evidence and compel witnesses. However, it has been designed to consider cases that occurred before the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, that is the 10th of April 1998. It's well-established approach to distinguish between cases that happened before the agreement and afterwards, and I don't think we should change that approach now, and the legislation setting up the Commission has yet to pass into law. Also, an independent statutory inquiry is an appropriate forum for examining the vast volume of national security sensitive information which the court has deemed to be at the core of the question as to whether or not the bomb could have been prevented. A disclosure protocol will be agreed between the inquiry and all relevant partners to take account of the national security sensitive material involved in this case. Thirdly, the inquiry will involve the next of kin and will be open to public scrutiny where possible. This will, of course, need to be balanced against national security considerations, and it's important to note that there will be some material which will not be able to be examined in public. A final report will be published which will respond to each of the issues identified by the High Court. Madam Deputy Speaker, you may be aware that in his judgment, Justice Horner expressed a desire that a simultaneous Article 2 compliant investigation occur in Ireland. He recognised that it was not in the court's power to order a cross-border investigation, and nor is it in my power as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to do so. But I remain in close contact with the Irish Government on this issue. Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to assure the House that this decision has been taken following careful consideration of the facts, the findings of the Supreme Court judgment, and the United Kingdom's obligations under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. I hope that the decision to establish an independent statutory inquiry gives some comfort to those families who have long campaigned for this outcome. I recognise, however, that not all families affected by the bombing desire such further investigation. Some have worked hard to process their trauma and to move on with their lives and do not wish to re-examine the past. I hope that the targeted nature of the inquiry, to allow it to answer the 4 points I mentioned earlier, will provide the middle ground whereby answers are sought for those who want them, without reopening avenues which have already been investigated to satisfaction. In terms of next steps, I will now proceed to identify a chair for the inquiry to finalise the terms of reference following consultation with that chair. My intention is that the terms of reference will be heavily based on the grounds set out by the court. Further details will be announced in due course, but it is my full intention to establish the inquiry as promptly as possible for the investigation to proceed at pace. It must be remembered that those responsible for the deaths and destruction on that awful day in 1998 are the immoral terrorists. As Justice Horner highlighted, and I quote, "It is important not to forget that the responsibility for this terrible atrocity, the worst in the last 60 years of Northern Ireland's history, lies with those malevolent and evil dissident Republicans with complete disregard for human life, planned, planted and detonated a huge bomb amongst shoppers in Omagh's town centre on a Saturday afternoon in August." I fully agree, concur with those words, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for the statement, but also for the in-person briefing that he afforded me and the team earlier this week. I want to begin by paying tribute to all those who lost their loved ones or were injured in the Omagh bombing. Last year I visited Omagh and I went to the Memorial Park, a beautiful tribute to the victims. The local community in this quiet market town has shown remarkable resilience and dignity in the face of unspeakable act of terror. The Republican dissidents who planted the bomb were trying to derail the peace process just months after a majority had voted for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. They did not succeed, which is a credit to everybody in Northern Ireland. Michael Gallagher's son, Aidan, was one of the 29 people and 2 unborn children who were murdered that day. He has been a tireless campaigner for answers. I'm struck by his powerful words that he and others and other relatives of those killed want answers so they can finally reclaim their lives. We welcome the decision by the Secretary of State that he has made and the approach that he has taken in putting the victims first in his deliberations. I know that he met with families before Christmas. I know that he promised that he would return personally to tell them whether he would order an inquiry. He has been a man of his word. In his ruling, Justice Horner was not prescriptive about what the Secretary of State should do. Indeed, other Northern Ireland secretaries responded differently to similar findings. It's important to say that if the inquiry finds shortcomings in how the intelligence was used, it will not change the fact that it was Republican terrorists who are ultimately responsible for the lives lost and changed that day. Any Article 2 compliant inquiry should provide the opportunity to learn the lessons that will prevent similar tragedies into the future. The Republic of Ireland now has a moral obligation to start their own investigation. However, the fact the Secretary of State is calling for this inquiry does clash with the government's overall approach to legacy issues. We oppose the government's legacy bill because it provides more benefits to perpetrators than it does to victims of terror. The Secretary of State has put Omagh families at the heart of today's decision. I'm worried that other victims of atrocities during the Troubles will be watching and wondering why their loved ones are not being treated in a similar way. For example, I speak regularly with the families of the Birmingham pub bombing victims, and I'm worried about how this news will affect them. Victims are already noticing contradictions in the government's approach to legacy issues. Rightly, the government introduced the Omagh bombing as part of the Troubles for the purposes of the victims' pension scheme in 2020. But today, he is saying that the Omagh bombing is outside of the Troubles as defined by the Legacy Bill. While the Legacy Bill is opposed by all parties and communities in Northern Ireland, I think his decision today will be supported by all of them. A seesaw approach to policy isn't healthy in any circumstances, but least of all when dealing with the sensitivities of Northern Ireland's past. Government has presented its logic as to why the atrocities committed in late 1998 qualify for a public inquiry and those before don't. But it's a logic only understood within Whitehall. Many families still struggle with the loss of loved ones, and their grief is compounded by the absence of information or justice. They simply cannot see the logic of why the crimes that shattered their lives are undeserving of similar treatment to that announced today, simply because of a date that appears to them suited to the needs of ministers, but not respectful to their needs as victims. I believe the Secretary of State to be a decent man. If he is proceeding with a legacy approach he has inherited, he needs to be certain that it will provide the same comfort and answers to all victims that he is offering the families of Omagh today. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Secretary of State.
And can I thank the honourable gentleman for his kind words and for his support for my decision today. On the main point of difference, I guess, in what he said, I actually do believe that we are being consistent. What has happened is that for hundreds, if not thousands, of families, over 25 years since the Troubles ceased and the Belfast Good Friday Agreement came into effect, there's been no justice and no information about what happened to their loved ones in that period of time. Investigations might have come and gone, but to no result for those families. And what the Legacy Bill hopes to do, and as he knows, I am trying to improve the bill as much as possible and talking to everybody that's got an interest in this legislation, including all the victim groups that I have met and my Minister in the House of Lords, Lord Kane, has met in the course of the last 4 months to try and make sure that we get the Legacy Bill into exactly the right place so it can give those families, if at all possible, at least some information about what happened to their loved ones at this time, which is all, actually, I think, Michael Gallagher really wanted when he started his campaign. He wanted to know as much information about what happened that day as possible, and I really do hope that the inquiry I've announced today will give that to him.
Ms. Villiers.
The Omagh bomb was one of the most appalling atrocities of the long campaign of terrorism in Northern